This is the second part of the book America's Secret Establishment: An Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones. Part 2 is about how the order controls education. And just to recap real quickly, Antony C. Sutton, who's pictured on this slide, was a research fellow at the Hoover Institute, Stanford University, from 1968 to 1973. He was also an economics professor at California State University at Los Angeles, and he wrote a lot of different books exposing the hidden parts of our history that we are never told. So in part 2 of this book, Professor Sutton again reiterates that the main philosophy of the Order of Skull and Bones, chapter 322, is Hegelianism. This is the idea that the state is supreme and all individuality should be submerged into the collective. In order to control the future of American society, it would be, of course, critical to control the educational system. Why? Because the youth of today, of course, will be the future of tomorrow. It started in the 1850s with 3 members of the order: Timothy Dwight, who was professor of Yale Divinity School and 12th president of Yale University; Daniel Coit Gilman, first president of the University of California, first president of Johns Hopkins University, and first president of the Carnegie Institution; and Andrew Dixon White, who was first president of Cornell University and first president of the American Historical Association. All 3 were initiated into the order. These men traveled to Germany to study philosophy at the universities of Berlin and Bonn. This is significant because Hegelianism was a very prominent philosophy in Germany at the time. Sutton describes 2 subgroups of Hegelians. He calls them the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians. The right Hegelians favored militarism, the unification of Germany, and the rise of Hitler. The left Hegelians, on the other hand, promoted the philosophy of scientific socialism. This would be men like Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Moses Hess, to name a few. Both of these groups, right and left, glorify the state as supreme and profess that the individual must be subservient and obedient to the state and to the collective. Eventually, this group of men returned to the United States and to Yale University, where they were very influential in getting control first over the science department at Yale, then Yale itself, and according to Professor Sutton, eventually the United States itself. Part of the scheme of the Hegelians was to change the structure of education in the United States. According to the theory of the absolute state, the function of education is to prepare the individual citizen to become submerged in the collective. In order to bring this about, the method of teaching children to read was changed from a phonics approach to what Sutton calls the look-say method, which was originally developed around 1810 to teach deaf students who cannot speak and cannot pronounce phonetic sounds for letters. An important figure in all of this is Horace Mann, who, of course, in establishment textbooks is touted as a great educational reformer. It was Mann who pushed for the adoption of the look-say method within the Massachusetts primary school system. Sutton reveals that Mann had direct ties to the order. In fact, he was one of the co-founders. The method was eventually adopted by Columbia Teachers College, which also glorified John Dewey's system of preparing children to function as units in the collective society. This look-say method was easy to learn, but the problem is it de-emphasized reading skills. The old way of learning, by having students break words down into syllables in order to put them together to make words, was denigrated as old-fashioned. The promoters of the new method pushed the idea that it would be much more interesting for students to learn to read by starting with complete units as opposed to letter parts. Another influence on the modern education system by the order was the import into the United States of the new subject of experimental psychology by a man named Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt was influenced by a German philosopher of the 19th century named Friedrich Herbart. This individual is not important to Herbart. His philosophy, the individual, I should say, was not important to Herbart. His philosophy was to prepare children to live properly within the social order. Thus, like Hegel, the purpose of education is not to develop the individual. Instead, the purpose of schooling is to impart socially desirable ideas to the students, and those ideas are about what is good for the whole of society or the collective. Sutton points out that in the article about the order written in 1977 by Rosenbaum, a connection is made between the methods and objectives of the order being parallel with those of the Bavarian Illuminati, founded in Germany in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt. Sutton quotes from John Robison's 1786 book, Proofs of a Conspiracy, about the Illuminist organization. I've read this book also, and it will be the subject of a separate video later on. Of note, however, is that in Robison's book, back in 1787, he points out that, quote, the candidate, this would be for initiation into the Illuminati organization, is presented for reception in the character of a slave, and it is demanded of him what has brought him to this most miserable of all conditions. He answers, society, the state, submissiveness, false religion. A skeleton is pointed out to him, at the feet of which are laid a crown and a sword. He is asked whether that is the skeleton of a king, a nobleman, or a beggar. As he cannot decide, the president of the meeting says to him, the character of being a man is the only one that is of importance, unquote. Again, the initiatory rites to the order have occult connections, and I'll talk much more about this later on. William Wundt was strongly influenced by the ideas of Herbart, and in turn, Wundt trained American students, including a man by the name of G. Stanley Hall. Hall brought the study of German experimental psychology into the United States after he returned from Germany in 1871. Hall quickly came under the wing of the order. Hall was also influenced by the teachings of Horace Mann, the Unitarian Church, a group of left Hegelians, and the co-founder of the order, Alphonso Taft. He was one of the first to receive a PhD in psychology, which was a new field under Wundt. Wundt established the field of experimental psychology, which is important because he believed that man is nothing but the summation of his experiences, nothing more. Wundt's philosophy was based on the Hegelian idea that the individual is nothing more than a cog in the state. In short, all of these individuals became very influential in the American educational system through their training of teachers at Columbia University Teachers College, the University of Chicago School of Education, and Johns Hopkins Medical School, all of which were funded by Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations. As far as my comment and critique and analysis of part 2 of this book by Professor Sutton, I have a couple of thoughts. First, there was a revolution in the American education system due to the influence of the members of the Order of Skull and Bones, or men who had ties to the order. And as these individuals rose to positions of power within many U.S. universities, they were free to reorganize these schools in accordance with Hegelian principles. These universities included Johns Hopkins, Columbia, Yale, Cornell, Minnesota University, Iowa University, and the University of Chicago. These schools alone awarded hundreds of doctorate degrees to their students, who in turn became teachers and professors. Dewey, for example, was appointed director of the School of Education at the University of Chicago in 1902. The School of Education was funded with Rockefeller money. Imagine how many teachers were trained at this school and others like it, and you start to understand the impact that these few individuals had on the entire system of educating our youth. Dewey's education is state-centered as opposed to child-centered, and I find this extremely concerning. Dewey's Hegelian way of thinking is in direct contradiction to the principles espoused in our Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. This is perhaps why the Constitution is no longer taught in most secondary school civics classes. Students are taught that they live in a democracy, and this is an egregious error, especially because most of the teachers teaching them this have no concept themselves of what democracy really is and where that word comes from. And that will be explored in another video as well. On the contrary, in a constitutional republic, the authority of the government comes from the consent of the governed. The state exists to serve us, not the other way around. It would have no power at all if we, the people, did not consent to its authority. We also have the right to overthrow it and replace it, according to the principles espoused in the Declaration of Independence. I'd also like to point out that Amendments 9 and 10 of the Constitution are often overlooked, and they should not be. Why? Because they read, quote, "The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people," and "the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people," end quote. Obviously, the principles espoused by Dewey and his followers are not in accordance with this. How did these individuals get so much power then to implement practices that are abhorrent in a government that is supposed to be, quote, "bound down by the chains of the Constitution," end quote, to quote Thomas Jefferson? Sutton proposes, and I agree, it is because they were promoted by the Order, an extremely powerful secret society. It is clear that the work of persons such as Professor Sutton would not be highly regarded by these schools and individuals, and this is exactly why his work has been suppressed. Sutton did not toe the establishment agenda. In fact, he exposes the undue influence of the Order in so many facets of our society. This is one of the main reasons our university system is so bent on pushing the cultural Marxist agenda at present. No professors would be hired who did not conform to the principles that have their roots in Hegelianism. Anyone who researches or attempts to publish contradictory opinions will not be tolerated. It is worrying that the textbooks used in American schools, especially the history textbooks, are connected to massive private funds given by philanthropic organizations such as the Rockefeller Foundation. These foundations have a huge grip on what is taught in our schools. I remember reading a quote by David Rockefeller from his memoirs. He said, quote, "For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents such as my encounter with Castro to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even begin we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interest of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it," end quote. Sutton maintains that the implementation of Dewey's objectives for the educational system were only made possible through the funding of the large foundations such as Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Peabody, Sloan, Slater, and 20th Century Foundations. In another video, I will talk more about the special committee in Congress, the Reese Committee, that was established in 1954 to investigate the influence of these foundations on public schools. Its findings were published in the Dodd Report, and it is eye-opening to say the least. To conclude, I have a couple of questions for you to think about. First, how do we reverse the trend toward indoctrinating public school students with the Hegelian principle of glorifying the state and believing subservience to it is necessary for the benefit of the whole? Why is collectivism versus individualism being pushed so radically right now by both the educational system and the media? And the purpose of education should be the development of the individual, not the creation of cogs to function in Dewey's state machine. Why is it so difficult for the American public to recognize this? See you next time.